So welcome everyone to in on this early December evening. Sometimes it takes me a while to figure out what the date the date is. We're very excited to do this program this evening, and we're even more excited because I think we've got a field program in the works for early 2022 that will correspond well with this. But before I hand things over to tonight's presenter, I wanted to first take a moment to thank Tin Mountain's Nature Program Series sponsors. That is White Mountain Oil and Propane, Hancock Lumber, and Ragged Mountain Equipment. We just want to recognize them for their financial support to allow us to provide these types of programming. I also want to thank all of you who are current members of Tin Mountain Conservation Center. Your membership dollars go to allowing us to provide these programs, as well as, you know, fulfilling our mission in other programming endeavors. And if you are not currently a member of Tin Mountain, we would encourage you to consider doing so. You can join right on our website at tinmountain.org. In the upper right-hand corner, there is a support us button, and there's membership information there. If membership isn't the right thing for you at this time, there is also a button there that you can just donate to our nature programs. And that, again, also helps us to continue these great programs. And we are in the midst of pulling together our winter 2022, so hard to say that, program listing. So I assure you, we've got some great things that are coming up in the new calendar year. And we do have one more evening program that's scheduled for Thursday, December 16th. We have our winter bird ecology program. And that is always, you know, whether you are a seasoned birder or you're taking it up this year, it's a great refresher for you know, the winter birds that we see around here. It is also a great refresher for the Christmas bird count, which North Conway's Christmas bird count is scheduled for Saturday, December 18th. Dave, what do you guys have for Christmas bird count dates?
We have the Pittsburgh count is on the 14th, which is a Tuesday. Errol Lake Mbagog is on Wednesday, the 15th. And that, I don't have the exact date, but it's the following Saturday. It's the Crawford Notch count.
So the 18th. So we're
yes.
So every once in a while, I was like, we're usually right around the same date. Sometimes we're one day off. All right, so we are the same day as Crawford Notch. So we have those programs coming up. The winter bird ecology program will be online 7 o'clock on Thursday, the 16th. And if you are interested in participating in the North Conway area count, you can find information on that on our website. You do not need to be a veteran birder. We take birders of all levels. So those are some of our upcoming programs. And yes, as I said, we are hoping we have to secure the date, but we are looking to add a winter tree ID program that will feature heavily, you know, the conifers of this evening. So the last thing, actually, there are two things I want to say before I hand things over to David. One, because he sent, as he often does, which is one of the reasons we love him so much, he sent a resource document that has information as well as helpful links. And I have put that on our website, tinmountain.org. It is on our website in two locations. One, if you go now or in the next hour or so, it is on the event listing. So if you click on the Conifer Tree ID program on the calendar on our side, there is a document there. There's a document there that you can download, but that posting will go away after 9 o'clock tonight. So on our on our nature program page, there is the link as well. And I can pull that up at the end of this program if anyone had trouble accessing it. But on our website, under our nature program series, that link is there as well. And you're also welcome to email me and I can get you connected to that as well. Other than that, just our standard Zoom virtual etiquette that, if you're not, I think everyone's already muted, but just keeping yourself muted so that we don't pick up background noise that is distracting. And if you have a question, the best way to ask it is to type it directly into the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. I'll be monitoring that. And if it's an immediate clarifying question, I will jump in and ask David. Otherwise, I will save those and ask them at the end, at which point you're also welcome to unmute yourself and ask questions directly of David. Woo! And that, yes, getting all that out of the way, I am going to go ahead and hand things over to our presenter for this evening, David Gabotsky, who is a frequent presenter of Tin Mountain programs and knowledgeable in a number of fields and areas, and a retired Forest Service employee. I want to say forester. David, is it a forest? It's
forester, silviculturist.
Yes.
Yep. Amongst other things. Yep.
Yes. And just all around good guy. So, and I'm going to mute myself and hand things over to David.
Okay, thanks, Nora, and really appreciate the invite to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is conifers, of which there's 97 in the United States, and we have about 16 here in New Hampshire that are either native or naturalized. And a little later on in the program, I'm going to show you how to use a dichotomous key, and I think you'll enjoy it because it's an online tool and it's on the resource sheet that you can see. So let's go ahead and we'll get started. All right, just a quick definition, a couple of definitions of what a tree is versus a shrub. The key thing is that trees can be, they have to be at least 3 inches in diameter at breast height and a minimum height at maturity of 15 feet. And a shrub, it's again a woody perennial plant, typically with several stems and less than 15 feet in height. And a conifer, the word comes from the Latin for cone bearing. And it's, again, essentially a tree or shrub that bears cones and needles or scale-like leaves that are typically evergreen. Not all are evergreen. And real quick, a gymnosperm, which is a woody plant with seeds. They're naked seeds, but without flowers or fruit. And the seeds of the gymnosperm plants sit exposed on cones rather than enclosed in a fruit, as they are with our angiosperms, things like apples and pears and other species. Real quick picture here showing you gymnosperms versus angiosperms. So again, naked seeds and cones is the key for our gymnosperms. But enough of that. Let's take a look at some of our native conifers that we're going to talk about tonight. Hopefully we'll get to all of them. A number of pines and spruce, and also we'll take a look at the balsam fir and tamarack and hemlock and some of the cedar and juniper species. So when we're looking at conifers, I mean, it's really an all sensory type of a thing. It's, looking at it, touching it, feeling it, hearing it. You say, how can you hear a tree? Well, don't they bark? No, I guess that's pretty poor humor, but no, you do hear the wind through the white pines, for instance. So there is a noise there, and there actually is a taste on some of the things. And maybe some of you have had black spruce needle tip beer in your life. I've had it in Alaska several times. I'm not sure if they offer it here in New Hampshire, but it's an interesting flavor. But we also want to look at the bark, the shape, or what we call the architecture of the tree. Where the tree is growing, is it on a dry hillside? Is it limestone enriched calcareous site, and so forth. And then shade tolerance is often pretty helpful for seedlings that are coming in an understory of trees, because trees that are shade tolerant, and there's not a lot of them, hemlock in particular, of course, beech and that, but that might help us a little bit on identifying some of the conifers. Of course, it's helpful to have a guide, a written guide or an electronic guide. And one of the ones that I really recommend is the Forest Trees of Maine. And what's nice about it is you can buy a copy. I think it's about $12. It's full color, spiral bound, has all of these wonderful tables, and it's also available free online, so that you can just print out some of the pages that you're really interested in learning about and go to there. So let's move on to some of those pine species, and this is actually, fairly simple to determine the pine species, because the real key on pines is how many needles do they have, and that's the big thing. So we'll start off with what we call the king pine, and that is the pine that probably is economically the most important species of tree that we have had in New Hampshire history. In our history with logging, it was the Diamond Match Company. They made matchsticks out of it, but it's also used for lumber for buildings and so forth. But there was an earlier history too that I'll talk briefly about it. Needles are long. They're 3 to 5 inches long. There are 5 of them. And one way to remember it is white, W-H-I-T-E, has 5 letters. And so that is sometimes a helpful mnemonic to remember that, okay, it's got 5 needles, so it must be a white pine. The cones are banana shaped. They can be 4 to 8 inches long, typically about 6 inches long and 1 inch across. And they take at least 2 years to mature. There's a new leader every year, and typical of pines, they often grow in whorls. And I'll show you a picture of what a whorl is if you don't know. And pines, and particularly in New Hampshire and Maine, it was one of the major factors that led to the American Revolution because of the British broad arrow policy. So here's a picture of a eastern white pine on the left. This is actually on Sargent Drive over at Acadia National Park, but that's a windswept white pine, very typical that it has that appearance when it's in the wind, but they can really be quite beautiful trees, and they're favorite landscape trees. 5 needles, as you see there. And briefly talking about the broad arrow policy of 1691, this is when King George I had decreed that all white pine 24 inches diameter, 12 inches above the ground, that they used a different measurement in those days, within 3 miles of a stream, navigable stream in southern New Hampshire and coastal Maine, were reserved for the King of England and for the Royal Navy. That was the key. These white pine masts, they could be 100 feet tall, and it turned those British warships into greyhounds on the ocean, because previously what they would have to do is they'd have to go into the Baltic and they would harvest spruce there, but then they would have to take these iron bands and put them together, and they were just never as strong as a single mast. So they're really quite important. And then later on, the king decreed that any trees that were 12 inches in diameter that were white pine were reserved. And so this led to a riot, the New Hampshire Pine Riot. And you can read about that in history. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. But on the bottom left, I show you a picture of what the broad arrow is. It's essentially 3 axe marks, and it's the standard that the British used to mark any of their ordnance that it was reserved for the king. And one of the flags that was carried into the Battle of Bunker Hill outside of Boston was this pine tree flag. And it's interesting. So just a little bit of a human connection where our country was founded, that you see this white pine. And of course, the flower of Maine is the white pine and tassel that you have today. This flag's gotten a little bit of controversy now because some political groups have taken it over, and they're trying to make it the Maine pine tree flag, because in one of its original versions, it had a script and it says an appeal to God on it. So look it up if you're interested. I have a reference in our resource list on where to go see that. Oh, sorry about that. There we go. So let's take a look at some of the places to go see some really neat pines. Tamworth, Big Pines Natural Area. This is part of Hemingway State Forest. There's a couple of trails there. One goes up to Great Hill where there's a fire lookout, and it goes by this incredible pine. It's 150.5 feet tall. The diameter breast height, and breast height, by the way, is 4.5 feet. So it's right about the top of my binoculars. That's where you measure it. So it's like 12 feet around. So you really takes a whole number of people to go around it. Big trees, a lot of big trees. There are a lot of big hemlocks to see. So Tamworth Big Pine's a great place to go for a hike. So here's my diameter tape, and it shows you it's a little over 58.1 inches in diameter. It's the biggest white pine that I have seen in New England. There's some taller ones, but I think this is probably the biggest in diameter. So the bark on pine trees, I mean, it varies from when they're young until they get older. And this is an old growth white pine at Piscea State Forest near Chesterfield in the southwest corner of New Hampshire. You can see the pine cone here, again, about 6 inches long. Big platy bark, big furrows, and the trees just go straight on up. On the right side, you can see a seedling white pine. Now, the definition of a seedling is a young tree that's less than 1 inch in diameter. And a sapling is 1 to 5 inches. So something to know. And so when you look at pines, and pines in general, they have what's called a whorl. So it's a circle of branches, typically 5 branches that come out from a point. And you get 1 year's growth between the two whorls. So you can actually measure. I mean, you can use a ruler, say 12 inches, 18 inches. You might even get 20, 22 inches of growth from year to year. And so that's a really fast growing tree. Pines are very fast growing. And so you do have what's called a terminal leader up here. And so it grows from here, and then it's going to sprout out again and then just go up. So you can see how fast they're growing. On the left, you can see the bark of a young tree, and the bark is often green when they're young. And they can conduct photosynthesis through the bark. It's not anywhere near as efficient, but it gives them an advantage because the broadleaf trees, like maple and ash and beech, it takes them a few weeks before those leaves pop out. Whereas if the conditions are right and it's sunny out, that sapling white pine is actually going to start conducting photosynthesis early and providing food for the tree. So it's very beneficial for white pine. And sometimes you see these really tall trees, and in the ecology community, we call these trees that really stick way up super canopy. And this is the super canopy white pine. And you can see it's almost twice the height of these surrounding hardwoods, mostly birch and aspen, I think, that's growing up in there. And in this particular picture, it's a mature bald eagle that's sitting in the tree. That's at Cherry Pond. I just happened to be canoeing there and took a quick picture with my phone. But these super canopy trees really stick out, and they're favorite perches for raptors, particularly eagles. Another really cool place to go is in Bradford, New Hampshire. There's the Bradford Pines Natural Area. It's a state forest and lands that has that. It's a short trail out there, but you can really see some incredible trees that are there. And one of the conditions when the lumber company donated it to the state of New Hampshire as a natural area, they said you're going to have to protect these trees with lightning rods. So 3 of them actually have lightning rods. I don't know who climbed up there, but they're about 130 feet tall, and there's cables that come on down. So don't check it out in the thunderstorm. That's all I can say. But a really cool spot to go and visit. And I'll show you one other place in Bradford. Bradford's pretty lucky. They've got a Atlantic white cedar swamp that is really worth seeing too. So pines typically take 2 years for the cones to mature. And some years, typically about 6 or 7 years, every 6 or 7 years, you get a bumper crop of pine cones, and they can often be so heavy and they'll actually snap the branch and they'll come crashing down. So those are pretty unusual to see that. Some of the problems, there is a white pine blister rust, and there's also a white pine weevil that's out there. But in general, white pines are, do pretty well. When they're younger, they are certainly susceptible to forest fires. And that white pine blister rust can be a problem. We used to see a lot of plantations of white pine, but because of the white pine weevil, which attacks the terminal leader, and then you have those side leaders, we call them laterals, that take over, you end up having a pine that looks like a cabbage. And so that's not a good thing. So we're switching to other kinds of trees for plantations. The next pine is Pinus resinosa, or red pine. 2 needles, 4 to 5 inches long in a bundle. And the technical term for the bundle is a fascicle, but we'll just call it a bundle in this case. Bark has a reddish cast, and the needles and the branch ends, they typically point upwards towards the sky. Of course, they want to get as much of that sunlight as they can to photosynthesize. Egg-shaped cones, they're about 2 inches long, again, taking 2 years. We see them growing on dry, rocky ridges, sandy plains, and lake shores. They used to be a lot more common to see the plantations. The Civilian Conservation Corps planted millions of these trees, along with Norway spruce and white spruce all over the country, particularly in New England. It was called Norway pine from its original finding in Norway, Maine, but we generally like to use the common name red pine so as not to confuse it with Norway spruce, which was not found in Norway, Maine. So on the left, you see that red platy bark tends to flake off a lot easier than white pine. And you can see the 2 needles. And it has a papery sheath here, which is actually deciduous. It actually falls off, but that's what is attached to the twigs. And here's a picture of a stand of red pine that was not planted. It's a natural stand at Church Pond Bog off the Kancamaugis Highway. Wonderful hike if you get a chance to go out there. Again, red pine needles are quite long, quite distinctive, and the cones are, again, quite distinctive too. These are open cones, and what happens on these pines in particular, red crossbills really like pines. They're kind of a pine specialist versus the white-winged crossbills, which tend to go for smaller cones. So they are around this year, and hopefully you'll see some in the pine stands. This one was above, it's on Rattlesnake Hills near Squam Lake, and a typical site for red pine. And I love these particular sites, and they just seem to do really well here. Sometimes you'll see pitch pine in these sites, but they usually on the lower sites have red pine. So one of the problems we have is red pine scale. It's an exotic pest that's devastating pine stands in New England, particularly along the coast. And it's also in the Manchester and Concord area at Fox State Forest and some of the other Bear Brook State Forest. They're trying to harvest as many of the red pines, because when you have a monoculture, just a single species of tree, once you have that, there's not enough diversity. And so insects can really build up and kill off the trees. If you go to Acadia National Park, you'd be hard pressed to find any red pine that are left. And this is what typically the scale looks like. And this tree is pretty well doomed, and it's pretty sad. So red pine is actually one of my favorite trees. I worked in the upper Midwest and in the upper peninsula of Michigan. We had a lot of red pine along the lakes. Pitch pine we have, of course, at Tin Mountain Conservation Center. Again, one of my favorite trees. I don't know, it's just ecologically so interesting. This is our only 3-needle pine that I'll be talking about tonight. They're fairly long. They're on a bundle or a fascicle. And what's neat about it is the needles can actually grow directly out of the limbs of the tree or the trunk. The color is a dark yellow-green, and the needles are really quite stiff. And by the way, needles or scales, they're considered leaves in general, even though, we look at them differently. Cones, somewhat similar to the red pine, and it's our only native pine that will actually resprout, not reseed, but resprout after a fire. And you'll have a fire go through. It looks like it killed the pitch pine, but it'll actually resprout from these epicormic buds that are in the bark. So I'll show you some pictures of these thick needle beds, and they don't decay. They're rot resistant, and it's kind of a feature that nature provided that allows for really the complete ignition of a tree in a fire. Places to go see them. There's a wonderful Nature Conservancy trail at the Ossipee Pine Barrens that's wheelchair accessible. Cape Cod is loaded with pitch pine trees. And of course, Long Island in New York and the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. There's probably 1 million acres of them. And you can also see them on the coast of Maine, all the way on up to Acadia National Park. Pitch pine, again, you can have some fairly pure stands. And the only other species that you'll often see in there that's a pine species is often white pine. And the oak species typically is bare oak. It's a scrub oak, very small oak that often will grow in there. So here's those epicormic branches that will sprout after a fire. This was after a prescribed burn, and it cooked the tree pretty well, but the thing is resprouted and it will do really well. So it's kind of like a phoenix tree, that and the jack pine. Here's some of those needles. It's the only tree, if you see a tree like this that's sprouting needles from the trunk of the tree, the only thing it can be is a pitch pine. So that's one of those key identification features that you have there. So these needles are rot resistant, and this bed just builds up year after year after year. And you get 30 years or 60 years of these needles building up, and it really creates quite a fire situation here, particularly when you have these lower branches that are very close. So this tree likes fire, it does pretty well. It's enriched by the potassium that comes from burning the vegetation, and they do resprout. The cones, again, you can see that 3 needles here, and this is a young cone. This is a picture taken in very early June, and you can see that they're green. They often come in clusters of 3. Many of the Western pines that are similar to this, like knob cone pine, will also come in those clusters of 3. And here's a picture. You can see a variety of age classes. This one's probably a couple years old. And this is actually a young cone right here. And you can see some of the older cones that are here. And the cones are called serotinous, meaning that it takes heat to open up the scales. They're somewhat resin coated. And not all the trees are serotinous. They've kind of adapted at this particular part of the range to have some of them opening up on those really hot summer days. But if you get a fire, what happens, these scales will open up, and it'll be like it's raining seeds that just come down onto that ash seed bed. So you'll have the start of a new forest coming in. And there are male and female cones. And the male cones, whether it's on a pine or on a spruce, they're often lower. And the female cones, the ones that we see as pine cones or spruce cones, they're windblown. The pollen comes from the males. They fertilize the females, and 1, 2, 3 years later, you'll see the pine cones that we typically see. So that's what the male cone looks like. And the best time of the year to look at that is late May and June to start looking for those male cones. They grow in some amazing places like rock crevices and here, and you get those seeds that just get trapped in there, and it's ideal. That rock warms it up. It's really good habitat. There's enough nutrients that are coming off that rock face to provide the water and other things that plant needs. And again, dry rocky sites, very, very good location to find pitch pine. Of course, the Ossipee pine barrens and the Concord pine barrens, those are on sandy, barren ground that have very, very low nutrient levels, and pitch pine does perfectly well on that site, along with bare oak, Quercus ilicifolia. The next one, again, a fascinating species. It's a species really of the far north, and it just comes down into New Hampshire. I think that the southernmost place that I have seen jack pine is on Sandwich Dome on the south-facing slope. And that's unusually far south, because really it's a species of Canada, does very well in the Great Lakes states. It's actually planted there for plantations. And if you ever get to go to another unusual place, but really worth going to, Indiana Dunes National Park. It's used to be a seashore, but now it's a national park. They actually have jack pine growing right on the shore, 3 miles away from this industrial city of Gary, Indiana. Pretty cool to see the jack pine there. But anyways, 2 needles in a cluster, and they're fairly short. They're twisted, and they're really quite stout. The cones are teardrop shaped. They curve inward, and they can stay on the trees for 20, 30 years. And not all the cones are serotinous. Some of them in our area will actually open without fire. It's considered rare. We typically report our locations. In New Hampshire, it's one of those species that's found, I think, in 8 locations in the state. Carter Ledge, which is Mount Chicorowa. Webster Cliff is probably the biggest stand that I know of. Welch Mountain in Waterville Valley is another place. Black Mountain, which is actually what I was referring to as Sandwich Dome. It's a subsidiary peak of that. South Sugarloaf in the Zeeland Valley, and then of course Lake Umbagog on the shoreline. There's some. So this is the equivalent of the western of the lodgepole pine. It should be the eastern equivalent of the western lodgepole pine. So here's a jack pine. This is the Webster Cliff site, and you, again, kind of occupying a similar site that pitch pine would grow, but this one is up at around 2,500 feet in elevation. So it's pretty high up, and it's almost looking like the Krumholtz, the crooked wood, but there's about 15 acres of jack pine up there. How they got there, probably birds, moved them in here. Again, here's that teardrop shape that you see here. They typically curve inward. Here's an older one, and they'll stay on the tree for 20, 30 years. And the fire comes through, and those scales will open right up. You can also put them in your oven at 160 degrees. They'll open up that way too. And microwaving is another thing. I'm not sure how good it is if you want to plant the seeds afterwards after you microwave it, but give it a try. So they grow on these really, really poor granitic soils. And this is just what we call grus, or rotten granite that is decomposing, and these seedlings come in, very well. This in the corner, in the top right corner, that's Route 302. And this is off the Webster Cliff Trail, which is part of the Appalachian Trail. It's not directly on the trail. You have to be careful climbing down. It's about a 100-foot vertical ledge. It's not real dangerous. I mean, I did it. And you can get down there and you can check things out and enjoy this really rare species. Or you can go to Lake Umbagog by canoe and get to see the state champion up there near the state park. So here's Lake Umbagog, a wonderful place to go. This is actually northern white cedar here. Kind of unusual to see a species of cedar that typically likes limier soils, calcareous soils, next to a species that the jackpine here and here that really like these acidic granitic soils. But Lake Umbagog, wonderful canoeing. Some of the campsites actually have jackpine. If you're interested, I could try to remember which sites have it, and you can enjoy that. So the Jackpine Warbler, what a lot of us call the Kirtland's Warbler, loves to live underneath jackpine. There's a certain age class of the jackpine, along with blueberry shrubs, that are around that this species is found. I was involved in a fire. I wasn't on the prescribed burn. It was called the Mac Lake Fire on the Huron-Manistee National Forest, and they were doing a prescribed burn to improve the habitat for this Jackpine Warbler, or Kirtland's Warbler, and it got away, and it burned 20,000 acres, and it killed the burn boss, and quite a few camps. I don't think anyone's home, but a lot of these second homes burned up, and so it created some really good habitat for the jackpine, but it was a little bit unfortunate. So I got sent there with a crew to help mop up the fire after it went through. Next species. Oh, and I should say about the jackpine, if you go to Michigan, the place to find spruce grouse is in jackpine plantations. Pretty interesting. Scots pine. Some people call it Scotch pine, but I typically, you can call it either, but Pinus sylvestris. I kind of like that Latin name, but it originated from Scotland, but it grows all through Europe. Does pretty well in the Baltic region, through Russia, and it's a very distinct tree. And one of the things about this session tonight, I want you to be able to figure out a tree, and as you're driving down the road, and one eye can be off to the side and one eye is looking on the road, but as you're going down the road, you should be able to see this, because the orange bark on the upper part of the tree is very, very distinctive, and I'll show you pictures, of course, of that. Another one of those trees with two stout needles, similar to the jackpine, 1 to 2 inches long and clusters. Cones are somewhat egg-shaped, and it's not native to New Hampshire, but at the turn of the 1900s, the eastern United States was facing a timber famine, because we had cut so many of our forests in New England and in New York that we were concerned that there weren't enough trees. So in 1903, we had a lot of forest fires that resulted. And so the forestry community at the time decided that we need to plant trees here. And so they picked 2 trees to put here. And one of them was Scots pine, and the other was Norway spruce. Norway spruce turned out to work out pretty well, but Scots pine, apparently the seed source that they got was not very good. And so we see a lot of really corkscrew shaped trees that are out there, and they don't make really good timber, but in Europe, where they grow, where they're native, they can really produce some wonderful tall, straight trees. So here's the Mount Washington Hotel golf course, Mount Washington in the background, Cog Railway over here. There's a lot of Scots pine that grow there. It's a very sandy type community, and it's actually naturalized. And I'll show you some pictures. There's lots of young Scots pine that come in on that particular habitat. So after the 1903 fire, this hotel, the Omni Mount Washington, was built in 1902. The next year, they had this huge forest fire, burned a lot of the hillsides around there. They actually established a nursery to grow Scots pine, and so they planted a lot of it. And so that's why that Bretton Woods area, you see a lot of Scots pine. And here's that orange bark, and it's a little bit flaky here, but you can see this from a long distance on the upper parts of the tree and on the limb. And the cones are directly attached to the twigs of the trees. That's called sessile. Not that that's not a test question or anything, but kind of an interesting cone here. And of course, the crossbills will go for that as the cone matures in 2 years. So let's take a look. Yeah. So as you're driving down the road and you see that orange, in a nanosecond, you'll know it's a Scots pine. And here's some of the natural regeneration, a couple of seedlings. Again, seedlings are trees that are 1 inch diameter and less. And here's the Mount Washington Hotel. And many of you have probably gone to the spa here. I haven't, but probably should. Anyways, I wasn't going to talk about black or Austrian pine, but I said, maybe I should real quick. 2 needles in a bundle, which is similar to even red pine. That's what it's compared to. But the bark is really a dark brown, not native to North America. It's widely planted and naturally regenerating in some places. What's really good about it, it does well next to salt water. So if you go down to Parker River National Wildlife Refuge, if you're on a birding trip down there, down at the far end, there's a cane deposit. It's a very sandy area. And there's a lot of Austrian pine that grow there. And here's what it looks like. I actually planted some in the backyard, and you can see it's pretty good growth, here. And again, you have these needles here that are quite long. The only thing you can mistake it for is red pine, but the bark is completely different. And the other thing is on this, if you squeeze the needles, they'll bend. On a red pine, they'll snap. All right, let's move on to spruce. And I'm not going to, go over this chart in detail, just to encourage you to get a copy of that book, the Forest Trees of Maine, and to tell you that, again, needles, in this case, needle length is probably the important thing to know. And what's interesting, I'll start off with black because it has the shortest needles, and then the next size up is the red, and then the white, and then the Norway spruce, which is not native. So black spruce, one of my favorites. It's I guess all of these trees are my favorite here, but black spruce, it's maybe because it often grows either on mountaintops or on bogs. Blue-green needles that are really, really short. Cones can stay on the trees for many years. And I mentioned that spruce beer is made from boiling the needles. And if you haven't had it, it's kind of like a New England IPA with a little bit of a turpentine taste to it. Okay, spruce in general. Spruce have these peg-like structures that are called, where the needles are attached. It's called a sterigmata. You can just call it a peg-like structure, but I'll show you a picture of a sterigmata here in a minute. So typical habitat, and a lot of times you'll see just the crown of the tree has the needles, and these other parts down here have died because this is a pretty nutrient poor environment in these bogs. Typical habitat, and again, you can see a lot of these lower branches have died off. They don't even photosynthesize. They're in the shade. These trees are tall and spindly, and they look like lollipops that are hanging out. They have, these black hairs that are, somewhat noticeable, and they kind of see the color here. It's a blue-green, and you see that with that black twiglets here, the hairs here, and you pretty well know that it's going to be a black spruce. And here's a black spruce, which is up here, that blue-green color, next to a balsam fir below it. They'll often grow side by side. The bark, very platy like this, loose bark, pretty distinctive for a spruce, but this is black spruce. The cones, when they're young, they're these beautiful purple colors. And I have a 3-inch diameter cookie that from a tree that had fallen down in a bog, and I cut it, and it was 160 years old. So they're very slow growing in these forest habitats. as the trees get older, they produce a lot of cones, particularly at the very tops of the trees. And they're a reliable cone producer year after year after year. So crossbills, and particularly white-winged crossbills, really like these smaller spruce cones. They will reproduce by layering. That is, the branches, lower branches will touch moss and they'll actually resprout and form a tree, which is pretty neat. The next one, probably the most important conifer of the White Mountain region, and it was really the target of, the big logging operations, is that red spruce, Piscea rubens. And the needles are a little bit longer, 1/2 to 5/8 inch long, and they're very sharp. One way to tell if it's a spruce or a fir is to grab it. Take your gloves off and grab it. If it's sharp, it's a spruce. If it's a kind of a furry feeling, it's a balsam fir. So that might be a little bit of a hint. I'll show you that when we get out there and have one of you demonstrate. Anyways, dark greenish yellow needles. The cones are a little bit bigger. And on spruce, they'll mature and fall the first year. Twigs are reddish to orange brown. And we typically find them on these well-drained upland sites, very common in the White Mountain region, whereas you go into the boggier areas, you will find some red spruce, but it's typically black spruce. And then on some of the better drained sites, you'll find white spruce, which I'll talk about next. And again, another easy way to tell spruce, and spruce typically are either needles are square shaped or somewhat triangular shaped, and you can typically roll a needle. So it's a spruce. Balsam fir needles are flat and you can't roll them. So that's another hint. So these trees can be, pretty big. I've seen 110-foot tall. This is Charlie Cogbill, who is the spruce expert in New England. He lives over in Vermont, and we're on a trip to an old growth forest in the backside of Mount Lafayette. And here's another red spruce. Red spruce often will be associated with northern hardwoods. That's two friends of mine, John Pastore, Vicki Brown. We're at Mount Sunapee State Park. This is an old growth red spruce, grown up probably around 1,500 feet in elevation on this on Mount Sunapee, and it's mixed in with northern hardwoods, which is sugar maple, yellow birch, and beech. And there's a lot of really, really big red spruce in there. So wonderful place to go if you get a chance. All right, so let's take a look. I took this from the Native Plant Trust. My blue arrow here points out to this peg-like structure here. It's called a sterigmata. You don't have to remember, you can just remember the peg-like projection here. It's not a stigmata, but a sterigmata. That's something else. All right, so needles, and here's a tree. These are pretty stiff. These don't tip over with the snow like hemlock does, and you can kind of see this reddish color, yellow-green color here. And again, another picture of the red spruce needles and the twigs. You can see that reddish color there, real giveaway. And of course, some young cones that are really these purple ones here, and then some of the older ones and different ages that will hang out on a tree. And red spruce, black spruce, they can start producing when they're 8 to 10 years old. Okay, if you're in an area in the White Mountains and it might be a little bit boggy in places and a little bit of upland, you'll often see black spruce and red spruce growing together. And you can kind of see this blue-green color of the black spruce and the yellow-green color of the red spruce. So that's one good way to tell, is that color contrast. White spruce typically found, I'll say, from Route 2 in New Hampshire north. Of course, we've got them pretty much north of the White Mountain region, but they're typically along streams, well-drained soils. They come in old pastures. You'll see them along the Maine coast. There's a lot of them that grow there. They're pretty salt tolerant. Needles are really quite long, and there's no hairs on the twigs. Cones are the longest, and there's, of course, bigger seeds that are in those cones attached to the scales. That's what the crossbills really like. The trunk of the tree, the bole, has very, very little taper, and they look considerably different than our regular spruce. I think the smell is pretty good, but people tell me it smells like cat pee. I guess I'm not that familiar with that. So here's what the tree looks like. There's very little taper here. And this is the national champion. This is in Pondicherry. This is 95 feet tall, big tree. I'm quite a ways away from it here, so worth growing to see. This is a 30-inch diameter white spruce. I know some of you have seen this tree that's in the Pondicherry old growth forest off of the rail trail. You can see how these roots come out, pretty interesting, and how it has that. And young cones, this year was a pretty good year for cones, so we should be seeing a fair number of crossbills coming in. And this is what the cones look like now. They're actually releasing their seeds, and their seeds that are caught on the needles. And so you'll see different kinds of birds that are going in there and trying to get that. If it's grown in an old field, it'll look a lot like those cabbage spruce that I talked about. And this is a white spruce that grew in the open and had lots of these lateral branches. And they often will have burls. We have a sawmill in Jefferson where I'm at, where they have lots of burl furniture, and they take the bark off and make different kinds of things with it. Norway spruce, real quick, not native to North America, naturalized. The key thing, long drooping branches that hang down. Cones hang down. Here's some of the pictures of the cones, and you've probably seen it. This is a pretty successful tree. It does regenerate naturally in some places, and it's a close-up of the cones. These are, favorites of a lot of crossbills. I got to move pretty quick here. I'm going to go through tamarack, is what I call it. Some people call it eastern larch. The range goes all the way out to Alaska, even though there's a western larch and there's a subalpine larch, but they don't get up into Alaska. It's the eastern larch that gets there. So there's short clusters of green needles, and it's actually about 40 to 50 needles. They turn golden in the autumn, and then they lose their needles. I mean, pines lose their needles about every third year. They lose a third of the needles. Very small cones that are purple in June, and they're deciduous. They fall off at maturity. And tamarack is the Algonquin word for wood for snowshoes. And so here's a Pondicherry picture, and showing you what it looks like in the fall. And again, beautiful tree. And you might, mistake it for even a jackpine because the needles are fairly short, but you won't mistake it for a jackpine in the fall. That's a bunch of pitch pine in the background there too. And so these clusters of needles that are here, this is a June picture, so really tiny, tiny cones, but they're favorites of pine siskins, small birds that will feed on that. And then, beautiful purple cones in the summer, followed by, the mature cones in the fall. Those are actually starting to open up, and they're very attractive to birds. They like wetland habitats, but they do extremely well on upland terraces. They just are not shade tolerant. Balsam fir, which is our familiar Christmas tree that we have, the fragrance is there. Key things, single needles, the bark is blistered with resin pockets. And the other key thing is if you can find the cones, they grow upright instead of hanging down. And they also have a pointed shape. And as you can see here, you can drive down the road and you can say, okay, that's a balsam fir, that's a balsam fir. A lot of times all the cones are up on the top here. So pointed tops. Again, the balsam fir cones grow upright. As you can see here, that's Mount Adams in the background. And closely related, if you go down to the Blue Ridge Parkway or you go down to the Great Smokies, at the higher elevations, you'll find Fraser fir that is found there. So very similar. I think you'd be hard pressed to tell the difference, but they are different. And they actually do sell Fraser fir for Christmas trees around here. They seem to do pretty well. So here's a massive cones. Here's a blowdown, but there's enough root structure that this tree was still alive and producing cones. Again, key thing are these resin pockets that you see here. You might want to stick your thumb into there. You got to be careful because it'll squirt out, and it got me in the nose one time. Turned black, but came off. Not my nose. One of the problems we have, they're very common. Balsam fir are probably the most common tree that we have in northern New Hampshire. Certainly the most common conifer. So we have the balsam woolly adelgid. It attacks the trunk or the bole of the tree. And these are about 1 millimeter in size. And so you can see this pitch coming off. These trees are trying to fight it off. And it's because we have warming winters. And the balsam woolly adelgid, that's not the actual size. They're only about 1 millimeter in size. But you get tens of thousands of these on the tree, and it just causes an immune reaction and tends to kill the trees. So we're seeing lots of dieback of the balsam fir, 2 to 3%. So we need some 30 below zero weather for a week or two. And typical balsam fir stand, you've all seen it. Above 2,700 feet, it's the most common tree. Part of it is because it starts growing sooner than the red spruce or black spruce. One fascinating thing in the White Mountains and in the northern Appalachians is that it regenerates in fir waves. And we could have a whole discussion just on fir wave regeneration. But you'll also get this epicormic branching. It's a witch's broom that's created out of these. You'll often see that on that. Eastern hemlock, Tsuga canadensis. There's 4 different kinds of hemlocks. There's only one other one in the east, the Carolina one. Don't have it up here. And there's 2 western ones, the mountain and the western hemlock. Needles lie flat. Leaders are droopy. Cones are very small. These trees can live 500 years or more. And the bark varies with age. They really like these cool, moist areas. This is a hemlock stand on the Brookside Path in Randolph, New Hampshire. You just go through, it's like, I call it the Valley of the Green Giants that are up there. So here's what I say about these droopy terminal leaders. And they tend to go in the direction of the wind, and they're not very stiff, and they tend to, flop over like that. So it's the only tree that will be like that. That's a conifer that does that. So very characteristic. The underside have these 2 racing stripes. Well, they're not racing stripes. Technically, they're called stomatal bands. And that's where oxygen and carbon dioxide is changed, the gas exchange. Very important for production of oxygen and taking carbon dioxide out of the air. But those are racing stripes, if you want to call them that. And if you see a hemlock and they're flat needle like that, that's what it is. Of course, balsam fir have that too. The needles do lie flat, typically on the hemlock twigs. They're fairly short. Purple tinged bark. The older trees, and particularly if you flake off a little bit of the bark, it's really purple tinged. They love growing in these cold, moist ravines. This is the Chesterfield Gorge natural area in Chesterfield near Keene, New Hampshire. Typical place where you would see these hemlock. Here's some new cones, those green cones, and some of the last year's cones that are there. Pine siskins love this. Goldfinches, chickadees, they'll go for that. We do have a problem with I'm sorry, I wrote balsam. That should be hemlock woolly adelgid. I'll make a correction next time around. I missed that one. This is a hemlock woolly adelgid, and you can actually see on the underside here, these are the adelgids, and they're basically defoliating this tree and killing it. So that's not a good thing. So that's a major problem, particularly on some of our older growth stands. And you may not know, though, that porcupines are pretty smart, and they typically will do a lot of damage. The one on the right here is Porcupine Girdling. There's a stream just over here, if you can see my cursor. They were girdling all of these young hemlocks, you can see the bark here, to kill it, so that there'd be no sunlight coming down, so red maple and aspen and birch would come in. I mean, these guys are engineers, so they're pretty good about knowing how to do forestry work. And then they do cause some damage. This is in Piscea State Park. They were chewing a lot of these trees. And so you say, oh, that's some weird architecture here, but the porcupines love to feed on these. Get near the end here, northern white cedar. I'm actually gonna skip through some of the writing here and just look at the pictures, because I think it has all the information. Thuya occidentalis, sometimes called arborvitae, tree of life, likes calcium type soils. These are scales and not needles that you have here. Not common because of deer. Deer love to eat on it. Northern white cedar cones kind of looks like a wooden rose here. And the foliage here, they typically have a good cone crop typically every year. Some years are better than others. Last year was particularly good crop. And most cedars, northern white cedars, have a right twist. You can kind of see here, and I could get into why trees have a right twist or a left twist, but we'll leave that for another night. But the bark has vertical strips on it. And here's a seedling, again, less than an inch in diameter. And if you don't have any deer in an area, cedar trees will come in and will really thrive. But the oldest northern white cedar that they found was in Ontario, just outside of Toronto. It was 1,653 years old. It's not this one, but it wasn't too much bigger than that. It was maybe an 8-inch diameter tree on a cliff, but they can be pretty big. This is the state champion in Clarksville, New Hampshire, near Colebrook. I used to work on the Ottawa National Forest and the Sylvania Wilderness, and there's a picture that shows the browse line. Northern, or I should say eastern white-tailed deer, they love cedar, and so they'll get up as high as they can, and you'll see that. I mean, they'll go into your backyard and do the same thing. Atlantic white cedar, quite rare in New Hampshire, more common in New Jersey along the coastline. But of course, as ocean level is rising, a lot of those stands are dying. So we're going to be more and more valuable here in New Hampshire. So let's take a look at some of them. Typical Atlantic white cedar swamp. This one I think is a Newberry, where I took this. In central New Hampshire. Again, they have scales, very attractive tree. Bark is kind of a grayish brown, those strips that come out like that. Take a look at some other places. Bradford bog. Again, Bradford has some really cool natural areas. So if you get down there, you might as well go to the Bradford Pines and Bradford Atlantic white cedar swamp. It's a wonderful trail out there. And this is a picture of the trail going through that Atlantic white cedar swamp. You can also do one on Cape Cod. There's a Atlantic white cedar swamp trail down there, but I would go to the Bradford bog. Really cool. There's a tower at the end, about 15 feet high, that you can climb up. You never know what kind of swamp creatures you find out here. As Chris Martin from New Hampshire Audubon, and the two of us were out there checking out these swamps one time. Real quick, finishing up here, Eastern red cedar. It's in the Juniper family. We've got 3 different junipers we'll talk about. It's two different kinds of leaves. The juvenile, they're sharp pointed. They're all like, but the older trees, they're scale like, and they overlap. Bark is brown. The furthest north that I've found eastern red cedar is in Bartlett on White Ledge. And is it eastern red cedar, or red with a hyphen cedar? So I don't know. I go with the 3 words, and separating red from cedar. Different people, they put it together, but Juniperous virginiana is what we have. So this is actually one in Whitefield. It's our county champion. It's planted though. Someone planted it. I mean, it will do pretty well even in Coos County here. And this is a typical appearance of the eastern red cedar bark. This is typically what they grow. They love to take over old fields, but they don't do well if there's a forest fire that comes through there. They're very resinous and they will burn with a pretty high intensity. And these are the cedar berries that the cedar waxwings, pretty much named for them. They love eating these cedar berries, but they're actually cones and in the shape of a berry. They're about pea-sized and they're kind of a bluish color. And some of you may enjoy gin, and gin comes from juniper berries. And you get that botanical gin too. It's really good. Oh, here's the white ledge. I'll tell you a story someday about the red cedar on white ledge, how I convinced a climbing school to get me a sample there so I could send it into the state. I wasn't about to climb the cliff. These guys just went right up it. And the oldest one that we have and was found in Pawtuckaway State Park. It's over 500 years old. It's called Narwhal. It's a really ancient eastern red cedar in southern New Hampshire. Real quick, we'll take a look at the last couple of slides here. Canada yew, which is a shrub. Again, it doesn't get up to be 15 feet tall. Typically bowl-shaped, and you don't see very much of them because moose and deer love eating the yew. And here's a close-up picture. You might mistake it maybe for balsam fir, maybe even hemlock, but it's kind of a reddish twig, and the needles are more of a yellowish color, and they just don't look like it. It has a red berry-like cone when they're ready. Common juniper, Juniperous communis. I've found that at almost 6,000 feet on Mount Washington, it grows all over. This was on Great Hill and Hemingway State Forest recently. I took that picture. And they're pretty common in old fields, especially really dry ones, and they're very sharp if you happen to pick one up. Again, the cone-like berries on that. And again, the rarest one that we have is the creeping juniper, Juniperous horizontalis. I think there's only like 2 or 3 places in New Hampshire. One's over in the Hanover area on a cliff by their ski area and inaccessible. But you can buy this, and it's called Bar Harbor juniper for landscaping. And if you ever go to the shore path, I think it's called at Acadia, you'll actually see this growing naturally out there. So pretty cool. All right, forest trees in Maine, I highly recommend. And this is another one. There's several good field guides. The first one was available online for free. That's a good one. Bark, I always recommend Michael Wotek's book. It's really great information. All right, that concludes that. It was exactly an hour. And may the forest be with you. So I'll stop sharing here, if I can figure out how to do that and see if anyone is still there.
All right, wonderful. Thank you. Oops. Went back to little. There we are. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you so much for that, David. If folks have questions, in a minute, you can unmute yourself, or if you'd prefer, you can type them directly into the chat feature. David, I was going to start off because I need a clarifying question, because I think maybe I just didn't understand. But when you were talking about the hemlocks and the porcupine, because my understanding has always been that, that porcupine like hemlock and that they're eating the needles. Can you say again what you were talking about with them girdling the trees for other species?
Well, I'm sorry that the porcupines were feeding on the trees with the weird architecture. It was the beavers. I was mistaken. It was the beavers that were feeding on the trees that were girdled, and that was right by a stream. So the beavers saw the hemlock there, and so they knew that it was not a food item that they liked. And so what they did was they girdled them to kill them so
To
that
kill.
they would get red maple to come in. So beavers was on the right slide and porcupines were damaging the ones on the left slide. So the beavers are really, pretty smart ecosystem engineers
Mhm.
on that.
All right.
Hopefully that answered your question.
Yes, no, that does. I was like, I followed you with the first porcupine slide and I think I was distracted and thought you were also saying.
I might have confused the two.
No,
Thanks for asking.
that is wonderful. And I had one other question. And that, well, I'll read this one that came in. Oh, yeah. So for hemlock, is Eastern, so this question came in again about hemlock. Is Eastern hemlock the only hemlock we would see in New Hampshire?
Yes, the closest Carolina hemlock I think you would see would be North Carolina, possibly Virginia. And they're pretty rare, and they're about to become critically endangered because of the hemlock woolly adelgid. The Carolina hemlock and the Eastern hemlock will grow side by side. The characteristics are different though. See them all you can.
All right. So my other question was regarding the tamaracks, and that, because I think that it's well known, that they are our only conifer that drops its needles annually. And I was wondering, is there an evolutionary advantage to dropping their needles?
Well, we do have bald cypress that are planted in New Hampshire, and they also lose their needles in the winter, but that's not a native one. So the evolutionary advantage for tamarack, they're living in an environment that's essentially a desert in the winter time. And if it warmed up enough that they would be requiring water when everything is really frozen, and typically in the wetlands that they're in. So these needles would be attempting to draw water, and they just wouldn't be able to do it, and they would probably not survive. So I think the evolutionary advantage is that because of the habitat they live in, they need to drop those needles and spend that enormous amount of energy to grow them back in the spring.
Okay, Mike has a follow-up question, but there was another tamarack question that came in.
Sure.
And was talking about, so Pondicherry, I think it is sort of well known as, I have gone in on a late October weekend with, a conga line of other individuals going to see those golden trees. Other than at Pondicherry, are there other, large, sort of easily accessible stands of tamarack? I recall, is it the Hancocks going in? I feel like there's a stand in the
Well, a Church Pond Bog, and along the Kankamogus Highway, there's 2 or 3 places that are right along the roadside that do have a fair amount of black spruce and tamarack growing. And there's some other places in Cambridge and Dummer, New Hampshire.
Oh, I was just gonna say that. I came down from Aziscahas Lake at the end of, early November, and it was spectacular.
Yeah.
And there's a hiking trail in there, part of the Umbagog wildlife. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about, David?
That's the McGalloway Trail.
And it was spectacular. Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of an unusual stand in there. There was supposed to be a housing subdivision, and they scraped off a lot of the ground, and the public decided, hey, we don't want to see a housing development up here. We want to protect it, and became a national wildlife refuge.
Excuse me. Yeah.
In large part because of that. And and that habitat that it created, that bare mineral soil, it just came up really, really thick with.
Yeah, it was
tamarack.
spectacular.
Yeah.
Just that whole area up there, it was prime time for tamarack.
Yeah, and if you go to the state of Washington, there's actually websites and special tours to see the tamarack of the subalpine larch that's found high elevations along the Pacific Crest. It's just incredible to see those in the fall. So neat. Interesting that the western larch, they'll grow 100, 120 feet tall, but to me, the eastern larch or tamarack tend to be more attractive because of the coloration that we have. It seems to be more intense. Another question.
Yes. So David, we have two pine questions that came in that seem, seem sort of related. One of them talking about sort of those super canopy trees, white pines towering over a forest canopy on a ridge. Oh yeah, or just, are they in danger of being blown down?
They typically develop a wind firm root system. It's kind of like a bell bottom shape to the roots. They're exposed to quite a bit of wind, and they seem to do pretty well. And the branch structure is such that the wind tends to go through them. I mean, occasionally they will, but white pine just seem to be very, very tenacious with their root system versus balsam fir, which is pretty weak fibered. So most of the time, the white pine that you see up in the ridge lines, they'll do okay. They may be susceptible to lightning strikes and that, but they tend to be pretty wind firm.
Right.
One tree that's not is often hemlock. Hemlock just seems to be very susceptible, maybe because of the soils that it grows on, but they'll often blow down and you get a really huge tip up mound.
So the other question similarly was tall white pines growing near a house. Is there a concern? But it sounds like you're saying relative to some of these other big trees, they've got a pretty deeply rooted and.
Yeah, the one thing about the houses is that, this white pine, one or two or three of them may have been surrounded by many other trees. And you took a lot of the trees down, and so they didn't have the time to adapt. So, that's one consideration. Some of the times you have a lot of rain that comes in and wind. So, I would be cautious to make a blanket statement that, all the white pines are safe near a house, particularly if it's leaning the wrong way. But in general, they tend to be pretty wind firm.
All right, wonderful. And we did have, what's funny, we were talking about the Eastern Tamarack, and we've got Sandy McDermott, who is in Anchorage, said that yes, indeed, she is confirming there are lots of Eastern Tamarack out there, which is
I just can't quite figure out why they don't have the Western larch and subalpine larch out there, but it's the Eastern. Yeah.
All right, wonderful. If anyone else has a question, if you want to put it in the chat feature, or as I said, if you'd like to unmute yourself, you are welcome to ask it directly of David.
And I didn't get a chance to show the dichotomous keys that's on the resource list. I mean, they're really fun. I encourage you to go to that resource list and try the Arbor Day one. And there was one from Brandeis University. And their pictures, so essentially a dichotomous key is it's a step-like set of questions that will ask you, is it needles or is it scales? And then you go from there, is it, 2 needles, 3 needles, 5 needles, and then you go to the next step, and then you'll come up with actually a picture. And another really great program is iNaturalist. I use iNaturalist all the time. And one really good way to learn trees is to, take those 16 trees and shrubs that I had there and to try to get a picture of every single one and get a picture of the trunk, get a picture of the foliage and anything unusual about it. And you will learn quite a bit about it. iNaturalist is just an incredible program. It's the equivalent of the eBird program for birders, and maybe even better.
And David, just since you said that, I am going to go ahead and just share my screen real quick. This is if you go on to tinmountain.org and you click on, if you click on programs and events, this is the community nature programs page that's going to pop up. And if you scroll down right here under the link for our YouTube channel, which after I get, which in the next day or so is where this will be uploaded. Right below it is this resource document for Conifer ID program. And that is just a Word document that has a number of helpful hints in it, as well as those links that David was just talking about to those online dichotomous keys. So lots of great resources for you to explore on there. Otherwise, if we don't have any more questions, David, thank you so much for another wonderful program. And we will let everyone know when we schedule, when we get our winter tree field program scheduled.
Okay. Well, thanks, Nora. Thanks, everyone. And
Thanks, David.
we'll see you on the trail soon.